Yeah. So thank you very much for the opportunity and for the invitation. And still, as a little bit of maybe like an introduction, I'd like to introduce the group I'm also representing, and to a large degree, what we are working on is a collaboration. So it's a common project. It's the working group for public sociology HZ. Well, we came together a couple of years ago when it was kind of like a moment of crisis for all of us as the country entered into both an economic and a political crisis, and the common ground that brought us together was that we were really not satisfied with the narratives around what's going on. And well, ever since then, it's an ongoing process for us to kind of reframe it or try to come up with a methodology, if you like, how we want to understand ourselves actually, which is very much focused on recent developments in Hungary. But as you will see here, and this is already also like a very short, like a theoretical discussion about the topic, is that we make a kind of an eclectic methodology to how to like approach ourselves. So what we realized, and it was not like such a big discovery, is that we really need an international, like a global context to put ourselves into like a more amongst interrelational forces, that it's not just us, it's not just our government, but it's a larger process. And we started reading critical political economy, mostly world systems theory, various generations from world systems theory and dependency theory. So that was like a basic framework we wanted to apply to ourselves. But of course, like in all similar cases, the major issue for us was that it's a different, like it's a theory from a different period applied on still like a different region. So how we modify it, how we change the language, which is more appropriate to describe our situation. It's not given, it's not a pre-made kind of a methodology. So as a disclaimer, I have to say it's an ongoing process. So we have a lot of struggle with this, but this is what we are doing. Besides this world system and dependency theory, what's the global framework here, we also want to see not only like the external global forces that are shaping our society and political institutions, but of course what's happening inside the state and how it's related with the global forces. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is supposed to focus on the interplay of global economic forces and these local social dynamics. And so we added this kind of a neo-Gramscian approach, which is more focusing on, if you like, this kind of a state class formation in a type of a accumulation regime that entered previously into a crisis, and there is a kind of a new type of a regime emerging, but with the global context. So this is like this kind of eclectic methodology that we usually apply, and which I'm going to apply. Of course, it's a very big thing, and we could have a different presentation on whether this is a good methodology and where are the biases and how to do it. And in the Q&A, I'm happy to discuss it. But today is not really about the methodology, but a little bit more about the story itself. So, yeah, what we like as a sketch or as the starting point for the analysis is still some buzzwords or some of the layers of what we want to focus here is, on the one hand, when we look at the global context, we see a kind of a dismantling of a previous hegemonic order. So when we try to put ourselves into the historical map of recent social processes, it's a kind of a realignment of post-war transatlantic order, if you like a capitalist class order. And we want to see it from a semi-peripheral point of view. So how does it affect Eastern Europe semi-periphery, and what's the role of the state in this transformation. That's like the very general framework, and I'm not going very far in the general framework. I'll more focus on the concrete historical analysis. So still like a few words what we mean here by semi-peripheral, and in fact like semi-peripheral dependent development. There are all kinds of definitions. What I'll focus in this analysis is, on the one hand, kind of a mode of integration of Eastern European countries into the international division of labor from the 1970s onwards. And again, this is a question why we tend to start the analysis from the 1970s onwards. Some people started it from the 16th century, actually, but it's because we are using this analysis of the systemic cycles of accumulation, and I'm sure you're very familiar with this. Professor Harvey's a lot of work on this analysis, like when there's a new cycle, when there is a new systemic cycle approaching, and the crisis of the previous cycle, we can detect it's happening around the 1970s. And of course, it's a question, what is the origin of this crisis? I'm not really going to that question here. I'm just trying to elaborate the story of Eastern European integration into the capitalist international division of labor from the 1970s onwards. What I'll focus here is a little bit of an economic analysis. So the integration here I'll mean as access to external finances. So how various financial forms or dominant forms of external finances are changing along the time in various cycles, and how it translates into this kind of a state class formation in different times from the 1970s onwards, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, kind of the changing dynamics in the international division of labor. So how the actual trade and production changes according to this integration. But this will not be only like an abstract economic analysis. So I'm interested on the class dynamics here, and I need to make a little disclaimer again, because what I'm going to focus on is more like what we call like an intercapitalist class dynamics. And if you use the framework like a dependency school framework, it'll be a bit of an analysis of the balance of power forces between major international capitalist groups, we might call them like the comparator groups, and the systematically forming national capitalist groups, and their kind of a changing relationship along these different cycles through the different mechanisms of financing, through the different mechanisms of organizing production. So the focus will a little bit less on the labor, more like how capital controls the labor process. But of course, we can, and in the working group for public sociology has that we have a lot of works on seeing it from labor's point of view, like how labor struggle changes along the cycles. Here, I'm more focusing on how the mode of organizing labor, how the form of labor control changes along the time. Of course, we'll see that labor here is not like a pure. We're not talking about pure wage labor relations, but it's changing. It's a very heterogeneous group. It's all kind of divisions there are along labor fractions and labor classes, and this will be interesting to see how capital is creating these divisions and using these divisions in organizing labor control. And of course, there's another layer here which is very interesting from the perspective of power relations, but I'm just going to touch upon it a little bit. It's the ideological hegemony, and so it's not just the economic and social relations, but for example, how what we call again after Giovanni Arrighi, the developmentalist illusion, the kind of a catching up ideology has been always reinserted in different historical cycles for mobilizing on behalf of a new kind of a power block. And this kind of a developmentalist illusion changes its style and changes its fashions quite contradictorily between different cycles. So if you look at, when we look at like something like a liberal hegemony after the political change, there was a very different type of language here, which was a catching up language compared to what we have today, which is more like not an economic liberalization, but a kind of a national freedom fight, but also promising a kind of a modernization and paradigm and a kind of a developmentalist illusion, if you like. So it's important to see how this ideology works here, but it's again not the main focus of my analysis. So maybe this was the theoretical background or the theoretical framework here, and I would just really jump into what happened in Hungary from this perspective from the 1970s onwards, and how these various forms of reintegration has come into a crisis and has been producing a new moment for a national bourgeois group, a national power block to form, which I'll argue is what's happening today. So back in the 1970s, of course, it was like a state socialist development. In fact, a very classical import substitutional industrialization in the Comecon countries, but it was, in our understanding, absolutely not separate from the rest of the international division of labor. It was already quite dependent and integrated into this. And Hungary is a very interesting case to study because it occupied a so-called bridge position. We call it a bridge position between Western trade and financial groups and the Comecon industrializing states or agents. It was not unique to Hungary, but so other states had a kind of their own bridge positions, but Hungary was very much vulnerable to it, or sensitive to it. So bridge position meant that this country imported basically technology and different forms of capital to resell it into the Comecon, to transfer it for the sake of Comecon's industrialization. And it needed to export something to the Western countries to pay off the bill. And what else could it export? It was mostly raw materials and energy from the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union had this subsidized oil export to these countries and allowed Hungary and other countries to re-export it to the West. And this had a very kind of a fragile balance of payment because it was very sensitive to the terms of trade between what's being produced in the East and what's being imported from the West. And in the 1960s, it was a very successful model because the terms of trade were positive, so they could more or less cover the bill of the technology and capital import. What happens from the late 1960s, 1970s onwards, because of many reasons. One is the oil shock, but there are many other reasons which happens actually in the West, like a crisis of the industrial Fordist regime in the West, is that the terms of trade suddenly deteriorate and change the course of events. So what Hungary finds itself, and many other countries found itself, is a sudden and deep imbalance in their external financial relations and having difficulties to cover the import bills. It was not specific to state socialist projects. What we see is a phenomenon throughout the peripheral or semi-peripheral countries. It applies to non-socialist, let's say Latin American modernization as well. I just want to show you here it's a graph from Hungary that in the case of Hungary it's really like early 1970s, 73 probably, when it turns negative. The terms of trade turns negative into both direction towards the Soviet Union as well, but in the Western trade as well. And what's interesting, I'll come back to the second graph, which I think really needs a kind of explanation, that it's been negative ever since then. So even you don't really see a political change affecting this phenomena. So it's an interesting thing why you have such a deeply embedded tendency in Hungary at least, but I think it applies to other semi-peripheral countries, to having this deterioration of their trade and financial relations with the rest of the world. So what happens from the 1980s onwards is, of course, it's an emerging crisis, which was originally a debt crisis. So the way they tried to cover these bills were temporarily solved by the cheap loans that you had in the 1970s. Again, I'm sure you know the story very well. These were the cheap petrodollars that could not be reinvested in Western economies, but they were seeking out to wherever, to the rest of the world, to the south and to the east, interestingly. So when I refer to like a new cycle emerging and how it relates to a form of external finances, we can argue that the 1970s and the 1980s was a form of development, still a bit of a import substitutional industrialization model that was based on international loans as a form of external financing. That was the major form of financing it, or it was a growing dominance of this kind of form. But yeah, as we all know, this was a very short temporary period when these loans were cheap and easily accessible. So as a course of events change, mainly in the United States in the late 1970s, due to the Volcker shock, suddenly and unexpectedly risen interest rate, the kind of a capital flight changed direction, and it had a massive impact throughout the semi-periphery, from Latin America to Africa, including Eastern Europe. So the argument here is you had a series of domino effects. In fact, a default of various countries is in Eastern Europe due to this changing form of the possibilities of international financing, the access to international loans. So what effect it had on the state, and the basic argument here is there were these economic underpinning, it's economic transformation leading to the political change much before 1989, starting in the 1970s, is on the one hand the landscape of their external economic relationship changed massively. You can see the rise of non-socialist export already from the 1970s onwards in the case of Hungary. You can see how, due to IMF negotiations, as many of these countries had to turn to the IMF to manage their debt, they also had to address austerity measures, and it really changed the social relationships. For example, how they were able to sustain basically still wage-based labor form in large industry. In the case of Hungary, they weren't able to sustain it anymore, so we'll see a kind of a regression, if you like, to a semi-wage, informal mode of organizing labor, which at the time, if you read Hungarian sociology, it was embraced as a peasant and bourgeois form, second economy, farmer entrepreneurs, industrial entrepreneurs. But in reality, it was not a, like a rising, new petty capitalist class, but it was like the downsizing of previously state-controlled wage relations into something like a non-wage or semi-wage informal economy. And from the relatively early time, I think probably Yugoslavia might be an interesting case, even from the 70s onwards, a form of direct investment, Western direct investment, arrives in this country. They're not yet the dominant form, but in various geopolitically fabricated forms, for example, in joint ventures or so-called TICs, tripartite industrial cooperations, Western and Eastern capital merged and did many projects, for example, in Africa, so in southern countries. It's another story. What might be interesting for us here is that though it was not yet a dominant form of external financing in this particular cycle, even FDI started to leak in and under some form of state control. But by the 1990s, actually officially by 1991, Comecon was disintegrated. It was stopped, and as we know, the political system wasn't able to control these economic transformations. What happened was that an acceleration of these processes, and what we can say from the 90s onwards, there is a new type of a cycle emerging. And I'm not talking about political cycle here, but for example, in the form of external integration to financial relationships. So in the 1990s, for a very short period, foreign direct investments is going to dominate the way these countries can manage their external financial relationships. It's mostly due to privatization. So it's going to be like a very specific type of FDI for a very specific reason entering into these countries, which of course has a serious effect on all levels of their economy, on their state, and on their class formation. So one effect is, of course, the downsizing of all kinds of former industrial capacity and giving space for mostly German companies who were themselves under a large industrial realignment to use these countries mostly as a production site for relocating the otherwise non-profitable, highly standardized production, and also to using them as a kind of a market, but that was obviously very limited. The other effect which we have is the kind of appearance, like the explicit formation of the Industrial Reserve Army, which was, of course, hidden under state socialist control, but it was like an explosion of unemployment and all kinds of informal and highly fragmented form of labor relations. What's interesting is this cycle was very short in the 1990s for many reasons. What I'm going to show you here is the limitation of the so-called privatization-based economic development. So there weren't that many things actually to privatize, and once you privatized most things, as Hungary is again like a good example, I would argue, for how like this kind of a shock therapy penetrated and how all kinds of industries were and all kinds of economic entities were privatized, but even that one didn't solve the problem of indebtedness and external financial dependence, because when no more investments coming in, but the income produced in the country as a form of profit or dividend or all kind of financial forms leaves the country, then it's just the reproduction of the same kind of a model on debt accumulation. And that's exactly what's happening in Hungary from the late 1990s and early 2000s onwards. We see the rising debt level, but it's interesting to see that the composition of the debt changes. It's becoming much more privately borrowed debt. It's not the IMF or not interstate contracts that's been behind taking loans, but it's private banks giving out money to private households, and usually in foreign exchange currency. So that we'll have this new phenomena from the 2000s onwards. It's a rapid rise of a bubble economy, which will be a very important reason for the political cataclysm that comes from the 2000 onwards, when this kind of a bubble bursts and how a large share of households more or less go bankrupt due to the changing FX rates. On this graph, it's just an illustration of what I'm talking about. It's an empirical illustration to show you how these cycles change. So from the 70s, you have the loans as coming in and rising in the external finances, but you also have the FDI from the mid-late 80s entering into the economy, and for a short period it's FDI overtaking it, but it's really short, and the loan is coming back from the 2000s onwards. It's one more like a collection of graphs which meant to illustrate my argument here. First of all, what we are focusing on as different fields of our studies, how fragmented really the workforce has become due to the downsizing of the previous industrial model and into the reinsertion or the re-specialization in this German industrial production. So obviously it's employing mostly unskilled or semi-skilled labor. So from the perspective of working class people, you see a massive force of de-skilling themselves or being employed in fields which is absolutely not fitting to their level of skill. This graph is a little bit complicated, and my own research is very much on this. It's showing the changing terms of trade, not just as an interstate trade balance, which is terms of trades about, but it's showing what's happening inside so-called like a value chain specialization. It's more like an inter-firm relationship, what kind of a value has been produced in the local economy, and how much local value added is produced compared to the imported value added. And we'll see a deterioration of here as well. So the share of local value added is shrinking. It means that the specialization in this industrial complex is also on a downward pressure. It's also on a decline. And maybe this graph is a little interesting because I'm going to go into the next phase of our analysis. It shows that how the indebtedness peaked from the late 1990s again, and it's a current accounts balance. It shows you that if you take the so-called European transfers outside of the picture and you're just focusing on FDI coming in, profits going out, the tendency is absolutely negative. But if you put European transfers, you adjust it with the European transfers, then it goes to zero and a little bit of positive. So this argument will show what the function of EU subsidies and EU money has on keeping this type of specialization in a somewhat financial check, in a somewhat financial control, without which it would be a rapid debt bubble again, and almost like an uncontrollable situation. Of course, we know that even like EU transfers don't really do it properly because of Greece, like in extreme financial situation, it goes bankrupt. But in a periphery country like Hungary, it has a short-term stabilizing effect. And the argument here is that in the post-crisis period, when it's very difficult to get access to international loans, it's very expensive, it's very unfavorable conditions, and there isn't really like much more FDI coming in. This is becoming the dominant form of external financing. So it's like a high dependence on EU subsidies for the ruling classes, if you like, to sustain their economic model, the regime of accumulation. So what happens from 2010, and this is the start of the so-called Orbán regime, but I won't really call it Orbán regime because it's not about a person, it's more about a new form of regime emerging in this changing cycle, in this changing environment, for example, due to the rising role of European finances, is a new type of a state class formation after the collapse of the previous one. So when the economic crisis hit in, when the capital flight accelerated, and when the foreign exchange-led housing bubble exploded, obviously, between 2009 and 2010, you had a massive political collapse. So the previous political elite just absolutely collapsed, and that was the kind of a sphere for a new type of class intervention, a new type of state class formation. And what I forgot about to mention is that during the privatization period, it was also dominated by international capital. So there were various attempts from local oligarchs and local national capitals to capture some positions in the economy, but it was super limited, even in their own highly protected domestic spheres, for example, even like in formerly public utilities or in retail segments. So absolutely like domestically embedded markets, they lost out. It was international capital taking over. And now in the crisis, of course, international capital was challenged by serious economic distresses and losses. So it provided a moment for a political and capital alliance to intervene here and to gain space as part of the crisis. So what's happening here is on the political surface, I would say, is a centralization of power on the various scale of the state, and this is in a very institutionalized form. The way it's happening is mostly through nationalizations, and I would really like to emphasize here, because my argument here is a little bit the other side of the same coin with the privatization. So renationalizing those assets that have been left behind by international capital for the sake of this newly rising national bourgeoisie is one form of stabilizing its position. It's happening in very concrete and very limited spheres. It's happening in those spheres which are under the control of the state's regulatory capacity. So it's in the domestic infrastructure. It's in some economic terminology, we can call those spheres of the economy which are producing non-tradables products, which are not going to the world market, which is like a local service economy. Parts of banking, retail, energy, media is a very, very important thing here. And as I mentioned, utilities. That's where the state comes back, and with very straightforward means it's taking assets over from international capital. There are all kinds of examples for this, and this is not necessarily like a deep antagonism between international and national capital. For example, in the sphere of finance, they just simply bail them out. So almost like a bankrupt international banks who actually did a lot of loss on this FX loan bubble economy are paid very dear by the Hungarian state to convert to give the assets back, and Hungarian national financiers taking these banks back and reorganizing the banking system. So it's a kind of a win-win situation between international capital and national capital, if you like. But in other examples, it's much more violently conducted, and there is a market push out, for example, in the case of utilities and the energy industry. In other spheres of the economy that I will prove, it's absolutely the opposite strategy. So production that's embedded in the world economy, that's producing tradable goods like manufacturing, or those segments of the economy that are part of this German mercantilist model, it follows, the state follows a different strategy. It's absolutely subsidizing international capital there. It's entering into a regional competition, how to give credits, how to give land, how to find the loopholes in the European regulation that tries to regulate this kind of a competition, not to over-subsidize capital in the sense that they would, cause disruption by going from one state to the other, and there is just an uncontrollable spiral of competition between the states. So we do have like a very strict EU regulation on that. But even this regime seems to be quite creative how to find the little holes in this regulation and maximize the way it subsidizes international capital. The most appealing example is the car industry. The German car industry has been taking enormous direct tax credits and all kind of state support. So what's happening is, and now here I try to put these external and internal forces together into this newly rising accumulation regime. I'm still looking for a good word for it. It's probably not the good word at the moment. I call it like a semi-peripheral, flexible Fordist accumulation regime, because it's Fordist, surprisingly in a sense, it's large-scale productions coming in. So what's disappearing here in the United States or partly in Germany is classic industrial production. It's coming to the east, and in Hungary it's absolutely on the rise. But of course it's not the same form of Fordism. It's highly flexible, especially if you look at the way labor process is controlled and reorganized. And it's obviously it's very peripheral, semi-peripheral, so it doesn't have a welfarist, context. It's not supporting consumption in any way. It's much more restricted on that. So the way this kind of reindustrialization is conducted by the state, I just wanted to give a few examples there. The state is very interventionist in Hungary. And very much collaborating with large German industrial interest. One terrain is the education, where what we see now, a direct implementation of the German vocational training system to producing semi-skilled industrial labor for these companies. And so kind of like mobilizing the unemployed people, the reserve army, to enter into industry, and also divesting from all other kind of public education from universities. It was a very direct siphoning off of funding from there. So it's a rechanneling money. It's very interesting to see their tax policy, because there it's, even you can call it like an extreme neoliberal approach. I don't necessarily like this word, but they, as I mentioned, they really enter into this very, very, very fierce competition. So right now in Hungary, we have the lowest corporate tax. By all measures, the largest 30 multinational companies pay approximately 3.6% corporate tax, effective corporate tax in Hungary. It's really amongst the lowest, whereas on consumption, as I said, it's not a supporting consumption. We have the highest value-added tax in Hungary, which might need to be reduced because of the changing European regulation, but it's a very, very regressive system. It's helping companies to actually channel funds from basically from lower middle class people to upper class people and to industry. And of course, the labor legislation is a very important and interesting terrain. Again, they've managed to introduce a public workfare initiative before this industrialization accelerated to. Some people argue that it's almost like a Keynesian kind of approach. The basic idea behind this was to reduce social transfers in those rural areas where unemployment was very high. And instead of social transfers, there is this public work that's being provided, and people are forced into public workfare initiative. It's a very dividing phenomenon in Hungary between various groups of scholars, whether it's good or not, who likes it or dislikes it. What I can say is it was a popular act in those rural places, because the rural middle classes felt very frustrated about the social transfers, so it was their interest to reduce it. Whereas, actually, for the unemployed people who gained a formal employment in wage and they were given even insurance, they also liked it. So usually it's morely like liberal scholars and journalists in Budapest who think it's like the waste of, it's like the kind of error in capitalism type of act, whereas we have to see that this public welfare initiative was helping the government to regain power. It was a very mobilizing force in the elections in those rural areas where people were unemployed for decades. But one more thing which we shouldn't really celebrate it is that the employer in this regard is becoming the local municipal. So it's been the most effective tools in the hands of local government or the local elite to discipline labor and to actually reintroduce something like a patronage, like a client patronage system. So it's based on a kind of a personal relationship with your mayor, whether or not you get a form of employment and what form of employment you'll get. So it's actually a form of disciplining labor and pacifying, stabilizing the power relations in these very marginal spaces. So I talked about how this renationalization occurs, and this is not necessarily interesting only from the state's point of view, but it's interesting from this rising new national bourgeois interest perspective, how they are becoming a subsidized and state-dependent, but a local capitalist class gaining access to various infrastructure and various domestic markets from which they can actually control labor process, as we see it in the case of the public welfare initiative. So besides this, and I won't have probably too much time, I also wanted to talk about going back to the global picture, because for all of these power consolidations and this new type of regime of accumulation, what is very interesting, how it rearranges its external relationships. And of course, we see this kind of a multipolarization of the geopolitical space. So when I mentioned the collapse of the transatlantic hegemony and class alliance, it's not just a kind of a collapse, but more like a transformation to a new kind of a geopolitical large regional class alliance. And what's interesting is Hungary is very, very active in this. And it seems to follow the interest of the German industrial capital, which seems to be less interested in the previous European, market project or the Euro project. They're more interested in actually in China and Russia. So what I'm trying to give you a few very empirical examples of how the Hungarian state, this new regime, is following suit behind the trail of the German industry with renegotiating its relationship with China and Russia. So first, a little bit about Russia. So as you know, Russian investments is actually rising in Eastern Europe, but this is a different kind of investment than the FDI from the 90s. It's more like pegged in some geopolitical deals. And it's very interesting to see the so-called Orbán-Putin, like a Hungarian Russian investment package, what it really contains and how it's helping even these local capitalist groups to use resources. So it's mostly in energy and in technology. So one of the most important renationalization projects was the Hungarian, this company is called MOL. It's the largest energy company in Hungary, and actually it was repurchased from a Russian state-owned energy company, Surgutneftegáz, at a very, very good price, which was financed by what the media calls in Hungary the confiscation of the private pension funds. So there was a large private pension fund scheme actually installed by IMF negotiations, and it was in a sense forced on the country to kind of privatize the pension system. But at this point, this particular government nationalized it and used all the funds that's been accumulated there from the 1990s to pay the bill of the energy company to the Russians. They also purchased other smaller or larger energy companies, mostly German companies, who gained very important strategic position, for example, in negotiating with Russia the contract, the so-called natural gas import contracts in Hungary. You have to see this was an extreme outcome of the privatization period, that this country, highly dependent on the natural gas import from Russia, and the contracts are not, made between the Hungarian state or any institution and Russia, but the private company, which is actually a German energy company, the E.ON. So they purchased that as well, and they wanted to regain this right to negotiate over the long-term gas deal. So there are all kinds of details here. What is important that they put all these assets into a large conglomerate. It's a national utilities company that controls the supply of energy to private households and to industry, and they very, very actively use this kind of a control in their political consolidation. How to subsidize industry, for example, or during election times, how to change the price of the gas bill. The other interesting example is also for the sake of industrialization. It's a deal with the Russian Rosatom to build a new nuclear block, which is an enormous block, very, very expensive for a country like Hungary, approximately $10 billion US, but we don't really know all the details about the contract because it's confidential. We just have some ideas about it. So they would double the capacity of the old Soviet nuclear block. And it's interesting to see that there were some negotiations about it in Brussels with the European institutions, because it was absolutely not fitting to the European competition regulation. But at the end, it was approved by the EU, because some of the suppliers, large suppliers in this project, will be actually American and European companies. So it's, if you like, it's a Western and Russian investment into Hungary. And of course, it's financed by Russian loan, so external financing coming back. So it's not only EU funds, so the state, this regime wants to, if you like diversify away from this very one-sided dependence on EU funds. So they're going back to loans and to the international loans, but not into the international financial markets, but they take the loan for these investments for a Russian state bank, the Bank. But as I've mentioned, the contract is confidential. We don't really know what's there. And also there were some infrastructural projects which were interesting, but I think I'll skip them. A few more things about the Russian relationship, because I need to emphasize how geopolitical it is. It's not just business entities agreeing and investing, but there are all kinds of elements of this package. So what we know is, for example, and that's very explicit, that Hungary, since 2011, when it officially declared this foreign policy doctrine to opening to the East and improve the relationship with Russia, that ever since then, Hungary acts absolutely on behalf of Russian geopolitical interest in the EU. You could see it in the debates around the sanctions on Russia, and Hungarian foreign policy is very actively helping destabilize Ukraine. There were many other interesting instances. For example, in Hungarian public, state-owned media, what you have is, of course, it's absolutely a kind of a propaganda machine, I have to call it like that. But investigative journalists showed that in various topics on migration, on George Soros, and on the EU, the public media is using Kremlin sources, and that's been proved they are these typical fake bloggers. But it's been really directly pointed that it goes into the public media, into the national news headlines where they're using this news. And I have to emphasize its importance, because when in certain regions in Hungary, mostly in the poor and marginalized region where the only form of employment is the public welfare initiative and the only access to information is public media, these two are becoming extremely powerful forces to mobilize people. So if we want to analyze how this regime is able to sustain a supermajority, the two main tools here are the public welfare initiative and this super monopoly in the media. There is another example which is very interesting. I just give a short overview. How they using their position between EU and Russia. There was a so-called Residency bond program. So the Hungarian state was selling residency permissions for non-EU members, $200,000 per permit, who would gain a European residency permit, and they put it into a fund in the Cayman Island. And it had to be actually even cancelled after a few years because it was so scandalously corrupt. And we know, again, from investigative journalists, that it was mostly senior Russian and Chinese oligarchs purchasing these permissions, and approximately 300,000 euros has been raised in this Cayman-based debt fund. Maybe if I have a few more minutes on China, which obviously has a very different approach. It doesn't have these bilateral packages as even like it's like a personal friendship between Orbán and Putin as it appears in the media. China has its own multilateral global aspirations, and of course it's using Eastern Europe as a region for its global aspirations. And probably nothing new that, of course, what China wants, amongst many things, is an entrance. It's a kind of an entrance into the EU as a market. Of course, it wants technology, and of course, it wants to manage its own kind of crisis and bubble and excess capacity to export it, mostly in construction, infrastructural projects that need to be spread around the world to reduce this overheated economy in China. And among other peripheral or semi-peripheral regions, Eastern Europe seems to be in a good position for this. So a few examples of what's been happening recently is China set up a huge fund for investing infrastructural projects in the region. It's not only in the EU, so it's like a southeastern European projects in Balkan countries, but also in Central Eastern European countries. Hungary is highly exposed to this. They have to borrow from Chinese banks, in some cases in Chinese currency, and these investments are usually going into infrastructural projects that's helping Chinese trade to penetrate here. So a good example is, of course, the Greek harbor, Piraeus, which probably was privatized as part of the Greek crisis, and it was the Troika forcing Greece to privatize many things, for example, its harbor, and it was the Chinese shipping company purchasing it. And since then, China is building a so-called high-speed rail connecting their now Greek port to actually Western Germany through the Balkan and Central Eastern Europe. So there's been an agreement. A part of this train is been already built between Belgrade, Serbia, and Budapest, and this is again financed by loan by Chinese state-owned banks giving a loan. It's super high, absolutely controlled by China. Parts of the infrastructure has been really built by Chinese workers, and it's very questionable whether it's good to these countries or not. So again, it's more like the liberal media in Hungary, but they made some very funny calculations that it might even take over 2,000 years to turn these investments profitable in Hungary. But we won't be able to check this. I'm afraid. It's also like a graph showing this external financial composition of Central and Southeastern European countries, how they are getting embedded into this multipolarized geopolitical space in terms of financing. And what you see here is most Central European countries are still highly dependent on the so-called EU transfers. They are the blue ones up on the left. But we see in some cases where there are large projects, for example, the Budapest-Belgrade train, that Chinese credit is going in. That's the gray, for example, in Hungary. And in other countries where they're not EU members, so they don't get transfers, they more relied on loans, both European loans and Chinese loans. They are the very southeastern European countries outside of the EU, so like typically like these countries. And you can see the composition, where does money go and into which country it goes. It's mostly, as I said, like transportation, logistic, and energy. It's mostly around the Piraeus harbor in Greece and the high-speed railway. And it's mostly targeting Serbia and Hungary because the rail will go through these countries. Yeah, it's a short example, and I won't go to the detail here. We had a paper on it, but it's very interesting to see. It's not just like as loans, but how it has a change on the currency composition of the debt. So what we see is a growing appetite for Chinese currencies in their reserves, in their external financing. So Hungary is again seems to be a good example, because the Hungarian central bank has launched many initiatives to get access to Chinese internal loan markets in RMB, in Chinese currency. So with Poland together, they've already issued debt in Chinese currency, and Chinese banks are now active in the region to open bank accounts for collecting deposits and giving credits. So it's again a little bit of a competition among these countries, but this regime likes to position itself as a little bit of an offshore Chinese regional currency market, and these initiatives serve this. And I think these were the smallest illustration of this transformation. As a conclusion, what I would like to emphasize is, on the one hand, which here is a little bit of like I was trying to correct the mainstream narratives on Hungary and on Orbán, what it is and what it is not. So first of all, it seems like Orbán and this regime is not hostile to the EU. It wants to be a new power broker inside the EU, aligning with certain fractions of the capital where it's most dependent on is the German industrial capital, and it's changing both its external relationships allied with this capital, but also it's trying to change the European balance of powers inside the EU. So it's not, it doesn't want to, dealing from the EU. It wants to change the forces inside the EU. This is one thing. Of course, this whole thing is somehow representing the interest of this new kind of a national bourgeois class in this very, very dependent semi-peripheral position, renegotiating its position with international capital after the collapse of the crisis, and it's regaining some positions in certain enclaves of the economy. It's obviously it's trying to get a full control on the labor process, and it's disciplining labor for its own interest. It's even selling out labor to the international capital. And it is also using this multipolarizing geopolitical space to diversify away from this one-sided dependence on Western German industrial capital, American type capital, and to look out for different sources of capital from China and Russia. And the so-called new Cold War narrative, which I think is very dominant on this, is more like a symptom, but it's not a new Cold War situation. It's not just liberal West and illiberal East. It's like the retransformation of these capitalist class alliances. So thank you very much. That was the conclusion.
I mean, the fact that it's all finance driven from outside, that I haven't heard anything about a basis for accumulation. And there's a certain level at which you can reduce social policies and tax the country, beyond which there's, is it going to work?
Well,
far it worked.
what I
appreciate what you're saying about how it's happening and what transformations are taking place. But, I mean, for example, I was even at a conference a couple of days ago up at Columbia, trying to compare the Marshall Plan and the Belt and Road Initiative.
Mm-hmm.
It was fascinating. What I learned from a number of the China scholars is the Belt and Road Initiative is it's maybe a couple of small projects. It's mainly Chinese entrepreneurs not to stay. Most of these are going to fail. There's no strategy to it at all, except a political strategy on Xi's part to sort of make himself sound like, you know. So even on that side, you know, if you ignore whether there's any basis of accumulation.
Yes. So what I see, or what this analysis was meant to suggest, is that these regimes developed along these global cycles, and of course there is a period when it extends, and there is a new kind of a power relations consolidating. But of course, it's never going to fix itself in a way like totally independently from these global forces. So it's readjusting to different forces, and they survive sometimes, but at some point, of course, it enters into the crisis. And I don't know how, like it's a very large question what's happening globally and where this kind of shift, this multipolarization goes, and whether there's going to be, like, for example, a new kind of hegemonic order in China, as some people think, but some people disagree. So I don't really know this. What I can say for sure that in this period, in this transformation period, this particular regime is adopting, actually. So I see the signs of a kind of a consolidation in their kind of a new intercapitalist class alliance, how it's forming, and yeah, so how it's going to end and what is going to be like some like external, you know, forces there. I don't really know. I wouldn't claim that it's there forever and now it's just a constant thing. It's I suppose like how the global economy is going to be reorganized in the next couple of years. It will have a huge impact on them. And it's interesting to see, for example, this public work initiative, because it was meant, as I said, to discipline labor and to, you know, bring them back into a formal into a formal labor market from being unemployed. But as this reindustrialization accelerated, it has become an obstacle for capital, because they were employed in local municipals, and, you know, German car companies were coming in and they didn't find workers. So they had to adapt to a new situation, and well, they're doing it. So they rewrite the labor code. Now you can even employ public workers in you know, car companies, and well, that's been done. So it's readapting, but of course it's a very dependent and a very fragile thing. And even if you look at these new credits and how and what effect they're gonna have, even in the short term, it will be probably very severe. So as the last governments of state socialism collapsed on almost like on the debt service problem, it's very likely that if there is any massive change just in this financial environment, it can have serious political consequences on this regime.
So thank you for this refreshing break on that. One of the things that, I mean, I study a lot of, or that is part and parcel of that narrative is the crackdown on civil society, imposed deliberately, or on independent media, on certain university departments or certain universities. But how does that fit into your framework?
Yeah, so the media certainly fits very well to this one, because that's a particular field where this kind of a national bourgeoisie, if you like, is very active, and again, it was mostly dominated by German TV channels, and so it was if you like, a market which was under the control of international capital, and that's been a struggle for a long time. How the political consolidation is occurring in the media. What's happening now is a taking back of not only the public media, because that was somewhat always under political control, but even private channels are renationalized, purchased out, or there are some kind of a deal there. And it's important because there is a kind of a new media oligarchy arising around the media, but it's not just a group of a bunch of business people who make enormous profits, because of course in the media it's a channel to subsidize capital, like state advertisements, all kind of state projects. But also, it's politically very sensitive. So you see how there is a kind of a alliance between the political oligarchy and some business groups come together and consolidate the regime through the media. So media is a key channel here. Well, the universities, like. It's very personal to me as well. Like I'm working. I'm a PhD candidate in the Corvinus University of Budapest, which is just about to be privatized, like a totally new system. Interestingly, not necessarily fitting to this framework, because we believe this regime was more using the state, like renationalizing for the sake of their associates, but obviously if you need to privatize, then they privatize. So the question is not whether it's privatization or nationalization, but what kind of a technology you have to, reorganize these social relations. So actually, Corvinus is about to be privatized, and I'm also a junior research fellow at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. You might have heard. It's also. So I was, for a few years, I was happy, like it's very precarious, but I have like two kind of academic jobs, but at the same time, both seem to just, come into an end in a form as they used to work. So what I see here, it's a very, very complex story if you go into the detail, and I'm not totally aware of all the details of the educational reforms, but it's on the one hand, of course, we see how education has become a very important tool for the reindustrialization project. So the government doesn't want to put much money into anything that's not serving its interest in controlling and producing labor for this industry. So they divest heavily from wherever. And they're putting that money into this vocational system, training system. It's interesting because the regulation of that is not even only, drafted by Hungarian state agents, but for example, we know that the German Commerce of Industry and Trade came over and they proposed bill draft. So it's if you can really call it like a colonial thing, that it's German industry, they just tell what they want and then they put it into the a new bill, and then that's an educational reform. That's really the way it works in certain segments. But of course, it's not only, again, like business and industry, and it has its very sensitive political connections and connotations. And the way I see it is, of course, the recent, like the most current way of how this political consolidation occurs. It's a kind of, putting the independent intellectuals under some sort of pressure, and simultaneously producing a kind of parallel, institutions of intellectuals, civil organizations. So when you, for example, talk about civic organization in Hungary, on the one hand, there is this enormous squeeze on organization that's been active for some years, but a lot of money has been channeled into new associated organizations. So it's a kind of probably the Gramscian analysis is very helpful here, how they want to transform these areas in order to create not necessarily the patronage system, but how it should have a kind of a political loyalty or kind of a political association with this, and there's all kinds of techniques using it, especially in the education, I would say.
I have a question about the national bourgeoisie
Yeah.
or the oligarchs. Whether actually this class exists in Hungary, or isn't it just one person? Because I don't know how much you follow Hungarian news, but last week all major media outlets were donated to one person, one holding, no?
Yeah.
So I mean, I'm really in trouble,
Yeah. No.
Like, the entire structure can be destroyed with pushing a button in Orbán's office. That I don't know if this class is actually there, or it's just.
It's an interesting question whether we like how to look at it sociologically. Is it really like some oligarchs, like some people, or is it really like a larger association, a group, whether it's a class or not? And you there are a lot of pro and contra arguments. On the one hand, I know it's a little bit of a schematic analysis. It's coming from the dependency school, even to see like international capital versus national bourgeoisie. Because if you go into, for example, a very regional scale, and the oil company in Hungary is a good example, how they had their associates in Croatia, and how you don't necessarily find these national borders, and it's more like a kind of a alliance between various groups. So it's also on the one hand schematic, but on the other hand, I think calling them a class applies because these are not just random people. So it's a very, we might call like they have it's a consciously kind of acting group of people. Of course, not a class, not just a class, but with the relationship in the relationship with the state. So it's.
But they can fall, like you see the example of Lajos Simicska. I mean, you can fall from one day to another, like to I don't know. Okay, he's still a really rich person, but probably not as rich as he was.
Yeah, actually, this example that you mentioned is important. It's again coming from the media. If you haven't heard, what happened was that one of the most powerful, he was an oligarch. It was absolutely an oligarch. Was in the media, and he was controlling all this kind of a media portfolio that's been collected together. So he was like an agent of the state, and he became so powerful that the government had to somehow intervene in his own political career, and he was removed from this position, and new kind of people have been put into this position. So there is this kind of how you broker these power relations through, both controlling, controlling oligarchs and how to induce like a competitive situations amongst them in order not to let like any of them like capturing very important positions. So it's I think it's in a sense it's very professionally made how the political class is able still to exert control of those oligarchs that's been actually subsidized and fed and reproduced through the state, but not letting them overtake the political class. This guy from the media oligarchy was a good example that he has become so powerful that it was perceived as a threat to the political elite.
But when you use the term national bourgeoisie, I think of a class, or at least
exactly.
So it's the idea of, I find this fascinating, and for me, just an aside, the parallels. For example, in Serbia, in relation to these media oligarchs, in Bosnia, in relation to everyone's employment is really dependent upon what the mayor and the local authorities are going to do. Entirely different situations, and yet there are too many similarities that it might make you not want to do a comparison. Mm-hmm. But then that said, is there a national bourgeoisie? You used the term.
Yeah.
I kept wanting to ask you, and then it seems too far away, but maybe it's remember Stark and Bruce's book when they're right at the beginning of the transformation, and they talked about how the managers of socialist firms, mainly state firms, all were able to transfer their skills under German investment and ownership. And so I just kept thinking that, at least politically, this class, managerial class, is going to continue to be important. Are they part of the national bourgeoisie? Who are they? When you use the term.
Yeah, well, I would say we have to go into concrete examples whom I mean here. For example, there seems to be, again, political associates who are given a grant or a right to establish like banks and going into the financial industry, and they're definitely like a kind of a financial group who's been capitalizing on the crisis and the renationalization of some of the banks or part of the banking industry, and they're usually managers, as some of these banks are state-owned. So if you like, the ownership or the capital there is the state, or it's controlled by the state. But some of them are private. It's an example, and we can go from the media and from many other areas to see that it's. So it's a managerial class to some degree. I totally agree with it, because it's not usually it's so closely associated with the state some kind of a state regulation or state control that it's not an independent capital, but independent in the sense of like, for example, acting in the world market. So I think national capitalist in a semi-peripheral context, maybe I would add this, that it needs the state to be for its own kind of a class reproduction, and then it's a very diverse story how it happens. It's not necessarily only property related, and it's not only in the production. It can be through state institutional affairs.
I just want to add another valence of national here, because I think it's important in terms of Fidesz's strategy, but it's also related to the political capitalism of the Stark and Bruce argument, because you guys would know much better than I do how much the story that Fidesz tells, right, of undermining the new bourgeoisie, which was the technocratic class, and communism, which they call communists, actually has raised up a different bourgeoisie in its place. Because I think that that's the kind of link here, which also then goes to the more popular explanations of nationalism, which is another argument. The question I had was, could this all be enacted without the nationalism? Or is the nationalism essential to its ability to do this, you know?
As an ideology, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, it's definitely there. So the ideological framework in this story is always like as I said, this economic freedom fight. So this kind of a developmental illusion. How necessary it is, I don't know. So as we see in different historical contexts, there are very different narratives pointing to the same kind of modernizational appeal. In this new regime, or in this new cycle, it's a nationalistic framework. It's always referring to the national interest. And I think in its rhetoric, it shows a much more hostile profile to international capital than it really has. So part of the argument here is not a antagonism between international capital and national capital, but a more like a renegotiating and rearranging the kind of class alliance, or kind of the structure of the division of labor amongst them in the European context, at least. But the way it's been done and portrayed by the official ideology, I may call it, it's a national liberation process.
And what about this question of the replacement of the late socialist Democrats as a new national bourgeoisie, right? The kind of liberal left bourgeoisie with a quote-unquote national bourgeoisie. In that sense, I know this is not the
It's a very It's a very good question. I can't give a very precise answer to this. I don't really know. I see something on the surface. I would say that it's not a total replacement. It's there are groups, individuals, or managers who are really coping well with systemic changes. Good example is again in banking. So, if you like, the most embedded oligarch in Hungary from the late 80s, who's been the most characteristic product of this analysis of Bruce is the head of the largest actually private bank in Hungary. He seems to be part of this renegotiation and being loyal to the government, to the recent government, and he is a somewhat independent figure. So he has a kind of a power capacity that's not directly coming from the state, but it doesn't mean he's.
He never violated that.
He never violated. So it's a very careful. It's a very careful guy. So what I would argue that there is a way for this class to adapt to this system, and sometimes it's a decision of the various individuals or the specific area in which they are, whether they can stay and co-opt, or there has to be a replacement no matter what. And I think there are examples for all kinds of different strategies here. I wouldn't believe that it's a total replacement of a previous managerial bureaucratic class. It's more like a cooptation to the system. But that's what's been there. So it's not not necessarily the national bourgeoisie I'm talking about. in a sense, the national bourgeoisie hasn't been there. It's been somehow produced and reproduced by these state acts, and probably these were people who were political associates or maybe managers with being loyal to this political class, and now giving some grant that okay, you're gonna take over that company, or you will be the owner of something.
Not a bourgeoisie. You need a new term.
Okay.
Did you want to?
I have, but I don't know if we have time for another.
No, I think we have a few more
A
minutes.
few more minutes.
Yeah.
By the way, they've dropped off some extra food from another event, so you should feel free to have a snack. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's about this. I don't know. I have this feeling lately. I don't know if it's correct or not, but I think you also mentioned that Orbán or Hungary or the Hungarian state has some sort of regional superpower like attempt to do, you know, like we are building stadiums in Serbia, in Croatia, in Romania, in I don't even know, in Slovakia as far as I know. And just 2 weeks ago, like we provided, or not we, like okay, no, the Hungarian state provided political asylum for the former prime minister of Macedonia, who was found guilty for like some corruption case.
Yeah.
So actually Orbán acts as a small Putin in this semi-peripheral like region. So I don't know. Maybe I just came up with this a few days ago. So I don't know if it makes any sense, but.
I wouldn't describe it that way. So I would say that there is this scale of the analysis and obviously the transformation of the process, which is not just in the state and not just global, but it has a regional scope. It's very interesting to see because it's very important. For example, how you make this power brokerage in the EU when of course, there are the ruptures in the European elite, and who's allying with whom, and how you can use not just your own state as an EU member, but allying yourself with other groups. And there is definitely a regional scope here between Hungary and Poland, for example. It's very interesting. And this is not just a political alliance, but I haven't brought examples here. It might have been fitting that there are many projects how companies from Hungary go for like infrastructural projects in Poland, or Polish companies coming to Hungary. So it's crossing the borders. That's definitely there. I would disagree with saying that it's like kind of a grander project, or like Orbán wants to be like a regional hegemony. I would say it's more pragmatic than that. It has its power consolidation in Hungary, and it's using these cards on the European level. And I would disagree with actually calling him a Putin clone or version, because there are many differences, and when we talk about the Orbán Putin package, it's better to see the geopolitical context, how there are some interests coming together, and how like Hungary can serve some of the Russia's interest. And for example, the example you mentioned on the prime minister from the previous prime minister from Macedonia, it seems to be again an interesting case in which this particular government is acting absolutely on behalf of some Russian geopolitical interest, and is able to violate previous European norms, and without much consequence.
The case of MOL, Croatia as well, and Ternadi, they don't want to prosecute him actually. So I don't know. I mean, it's like
So the case of MOL is again how regionally it's being organized, it's a good example because it's going to be like a large energy company which has its subsidiaries and infrastructural projects, not just in the state, but in neighborhood countries. So, yeah, when we talk about like the formation of these new class alliances, there's definitely this scope of various, you can call them like different national bourgeois fractions in different countries, sharing some interests, and there's a coordination how they act. And this is again one of the reasons why I tend to look at it as a kind of a class project, because it's so coordinated.
I have a question that was a little bit more continuous with an earlier conversation, but when you were talking about the redistribution of resources for knowledge production and education towards labor concerns, very specific labor concerns, I was wondering how the new National Strategy Institute fits into this. Like, what goes on there?
Which institute?
Nemzeti Stratégiai Intézet, whatever it's called.
Yeah, I don't actually know too much about it.
Because a friend at the Academy of Sciences in Népráz, in ethnography, is who works on like these kind of, he's not a whatever, we're being recorded, but he's not, he works on something that could be traditionally like the Horthy regime would love, because he's studying the Mansi, but he's actually concerned also for his job, because he says the resources from the Academy of Sciences are being transferred to the National Strategy Institute.
Okay.
But what I'm not clear on is it's called National Strategy, but I don't get the sense that it's focusing on like this traditional way of hegemonic notions of the nation, right, related to migration or Magyarság, but rather towards maybe these other questions that you're talking about, this kind of economic strategy of this quote-unquote national bourgeoisie, but I'm unclear on it, which was why I was hoping you could speak to it.
I don't really know much about this particular institution. What I know is of course, on the one hand, there are these parallel institutional constructions. So as they kind of reform the state, there are many ways to do it, and one of the techniques here, it's been there for some time, is they just create a parallel institution, like a academic institution, and they rechannel funds there, and they create a competitive situation between all the institutions and new institutions, of course, and the state will have a very discriminatory approach in this. And it's not. And what is interesting, I think, I know a little bit more about the education and for example, departments of economy, how it works, is that it's not just a question of new institutions and who's controlling it and whether it's loyal politically or not, but it's also in knowledge production. So if you like, even in economic debates, there's a new group of technocratic economists. Some of them have been already there. Some of them are even like celebrated economists, and there are a lot of new generations coming in, all in this institutionalizational process, claiming something like an economic paradigm of this whole thing, and of course using the rhetoric of national liberation, if you like, but it's you also trying to put it into like economic planning or an economic analysis. So it's also like this classical technocracy in this new regime, how it's formed, and of course these institutions are highly important in this. And I think it's also a good question, like why is it necessary to do it this way? And probably I would argue yes, because of course other technocrats or other if you like, agents from different institutions or from different kind of a knowledge are not necessarily loyal to this regime. So that's a potential, critique or a kind of a autonomy relative to the institutionalization of the states. Of course, part of the power consolidation is to, get rid of old generation of technocrats and make your own technocrats. I think that's been here. It's interesting, like strategic planning, because in the economic paradigm, of course, they said like it's not the market. They in a sense they of course made a very interesting critique to the mainstream liberal economic theories. And for example, for us, like critical leftist scholars, the real danger was that some of the ideas which we use, like let's say Gramscian analysis, can be overtaken and reformulated into this economic paradigm.
You were just telling me that Orbán's dissertation was on
yeah,
which I hadn't known.
Yeah, like using a Gramscian methodology. And so when we write about it, and also like in a political debate, sometimes I think the conclusion is that if you look at it as a technique or as a strategy, like how you mobilize a social force, it's a very interesting one to nationalize banks and bring the state back in. How you reallocate funds. It could have been a good thing. It's good or bad per se. What makes it very problematic thing that it's for a very specific class project, for a very specific class, and yeah, not in that sense. It's not the Gramscian project.
Yeah, but it is, Mary's reference to Horthy's regime is fascinating in this regard, because it does make me wonder, what are the elements of reproduction, or maybe that might be not imitation, continuation over historical time in Hungary? What are the elements not? I mean, you're doing a very good job, and most people talk about Hungary in this regime, talk also about the political strategy. But what is the economic strategy? Where are they getting their ideas? Are they simply borrowing from the past? It's a really interesting question.
Yeah. So comparisons to the Horthy regime is usually not just in the economy. It's more like the symbolic and political institutional. Yeah.
But her point is
on the economy. Yeah.
National strategy.
Well, I mean, actually, my argument was that under Horthy, in terms of the reproduction of nationalism as an ideological construct, they would have been supporting these people who researched the Far East relatives of Hungarians.
Yeah.
Right? So I actually wasn't making that argument. Actually, my argument would be that the ruse of populism hides the difference between so-called populist governments in terms of what the economic strategies are, actually. That actually by saying this guy's a populist, that guy's a populist, that guy's a populist, it keeps us from looking at the specific economic strategies and which classes are being reproduced or,
Everywhere.
Yeah, I would say that the tendency right now to compare quote-unquote populist regimes hides the specific of the economic strategies.
Yeah.
And that's actually a big problem right now because we're not noticing, how what the economic strategies are. And then it's all about, the nation, but it's a very different type of nation that you're talking about when you talk about a national bourgeoisie in a world system, bourgeoisie in a world system sense, or even like self-determination of the nation economically versus not letting migrants in or racism against Roma, et cetera, et cetera.
And I guess I realize I'm biased by thinking about Martha, my sister's work, of looking at policies in the 50s being based on what people already were doing in the 30s.
Yeah.
Whether there's a kind
of continuity is important. I just can't say exactly where it lies. Because the kind of superficial continuity, the superficial comparison is made to Horthyism in terms of the
populism.
quote unquote populism or the ideological nationalism. But in my opinion, it's I mean, these two, I've spoken to both of them, so they might disagree with me on this point. But I would say that the continuity is not so clear across the socialist regime from Horthyism to Orbánism in terms of the use of the nation and ethnicity and race. Not that there aren't lines of
But I'm only interested in economic strategy.
Yeah.
So that's really
It's a very good question. I
mean, isn't the renaming of Moskva there? That guy was an economist, right? What's his name?
Seilkan, yeah, he was a minister.
So that was a reference to a Horthyist economist.
No, you have a lot of references. But if I understand your question, whether like really like in the technocratic lineage, like if there are policy makers and economic planners from previous epochs active in this regime.
That would be the mechanism, but I want to ask it first, who are they talking to, where are they learning what their ideas should be? I mean, this is some strategic. And so maybe one mechanism is this continuity over time of human beings who are in particular roles who have ideas and it's not knowledge production is reproduction. I don't know. I'm just curious about where they're getting their economic strategy.
I can say a few things about it. It's not very clear, and one thing. Well, I think it's important here is that maybe in the analysis it looks like a very well planned, economically underpinned strategy, but it's not really. And no. I know. It's not. That's not what you mean.
Our government, and they have to, back to my question, they have to figure out how to survive over a long time.
Yeah, so no, I'm just saying that it's not. So when these economic theories they refer to or they use, they aren't like very well elaborated theories. They sometimes really working on more like on the ideological level, and they are implemented in university debates and in the power relations. And the stake there is not really to have the proper, background of supporting this. There is an attempt to that, but what's interesting here is, of course, it's a different level of the hegemony. So, for example, in the sphere of science or culture, you don't. I mean, that's a different environment in a bit. So they just can't, simply make a new, like an alternative, cultural narratives. They try to channel funds there, and there are like writers who are supported, but it's like the way it's been like literature is so important in Hungary. The way it's been canonized is not just something you change overnight, and usually these spheres remain somewhat marginal, despite the fact a lot of money has been channeled there. For example, in cultural institutions. So. But still, what I think maybe it's an important line in this story is there are a few technocrats, a few people we know, even one who is the recent head of the central bank, Gerőcs, who was previously a economic minister, and his bio goes back to the 80s, so he was even part of the kind of like liberal monetarist projects there, but. In the 90s, I'm not sure exactly for what reasons, but he got alienated from the then dominant like monetarist guys, and he allied himself to this party, and he's almost like the sole kind of a long-term technocratic guy, like who's really an economist, who was there when privatization happened. Actually, in some points he was for privatizations, whereas he's probably really good at understanding how this technically work, and he's applying it now in the renationalization process. The interesting thing is now that he has really become like a powerful person, like he is back in power. Now one of his efforts is to then create, like an institutional environment around himself. And well, it's a big question whether you can just do it in this time frame, and it's whether the state and money is enough just to do such a thing in a short run, because of course when we know well like how these monetarist groups came into power in Hungary from the 80s onwards, it's a very long story with a lot of global references here. So I would claim it's limited whether he would be really able to make such a kind of a technocratic support, which probably this regime would need, and there's endless funds to do this, but it's still limited if there would be enough people educated, qualified, experienced, and even creating what they call like an unorthodox economic theory, which I would say like from a very economic point of view, it's not unorthodox. It's like a little bit of a eclectic ideology and put various.
Let's get as much money from the EU and Russia and China as possible. Full stop. That's all I learned.
Yeah, if I want to be really cynical, I would just say the driving ideology is to steal the most money with the least attention.
Yeah.
And I don't know that unorthodox strategy. No, I'm sorry. I mean, no, there's not.
But there is an attempt and fair success at maybe what's not creating a national bourgeoisie, but a set of clients who are so dependent to reproduce their wealth on the state that they can't really abandon the state. Some of them get kicked out.
But how are they reproducing their wealth? What's the strategy for those individuals?
They've been offered, corporate people to manage. Media. What's his best friend guy from his village?
Mészáros Lőric, the mayor of
right, so he's a mayor, but he also has like a number of enterprises under his control.
We don't even know how much. It's a matter of.
There still are some enterprises.
Beyond the Germans.
That's my question.
Well, actually, what he built a stadium, right? Isn't that the thing?
He built everything. He built roads. He built stadiums.
So for the national bourgeois class, maybe one good example that's been always there, not only in this era, but even I would say like in the neoliberal hegemonic era, because of course the political class understood that some form of economic base you need, and you just can't depend on German capital. So one of the market niches, there's been always an active state, fund allocation for companies and groups, and that's construction, of course, and it's very much around housing, and it's a very nice combination of how class policies can be designed. It's very, very explicit in the case of Hungary, like a wealthy upper class being absolutely over-subsidized with housing credits and providing land and all kind of things.
They're also pronatalists, right?
Sorry?
They also support family, like...
But also to feed like a kind of a group of capitals who can still be somewhat protected from international capital to some degree, like who's going to build the houses, the infrastructure, so kind of a domestically embedded capital. And construction has always, it's been always been there in any era. And if you
know that was mafia.
So it's
but the capital leaves the country through debt from the distance between the forint and the Swiss franc. So that's how capital leaves, is via the debt, the household debt.
So for example, they nationalized those even like houses and there was also a huge fund where they put all these indebted properties that went bankrupt, that actually banks took it over, and then the state either purchased it from the bank or actually they purchased the bank, and then it was interesting. It was not like they gave back to the people. They put it into a fund and they, technically like redistributed these assets. And it was also like a very disciplinary process. Who managed to get access to this and who didn't manage to access. And what I would argue for is I would say it was a very, very explicit class policy there. Who would be supported by the state and who wouldn't.
They didn't sell the houses, they just redistributed them to other people. Is that
Yeah.
what you're saying?
Yeah.
I don't see where the money is coming from.
For doing the, I mean, like a generalized perspective, of course, there are two things here. So first of all, due to this reindustrialization, there is German industrial capital there. So there is EU funds there, for example. So money like this, money is coming in. They use the money to reduce the so-called the currency exposure, that they don't owe debt in foreign currency to large capital. And then if you have such a relatively fortunate situation that you're not exposed to foreign exchange, then they have the central bank. The central bank is a key institute in this whole story. This guy is no coincidence he's there. And then they print money. They produce money. So in foreign terms, they can intervene in the monetary affairs. They're just very scared not to have an effect on the exchange rate or not to get exposed to the capital that has to be repaid to the international capital.
So,
Back to Susan's question. We've heard a lot about where value is appropriated, but not where it's produced. I think you're constantly saying, what the hell are they producing there in Hungary? And I wondered, though, about, there's no discussion, you didn't discuss much the degree to which the agrarian sector is important.
Yes, it's very important though. So where the value is being produced is it's, I would argue, it's very much still dominated by the international capital, with which this regime needs to realign it. So, for example, it's still large multinationals companies, car industry, electronic industry, using large amounts of the. So they are the big employers.
But a lot of that value, if it's produced in Hungary, will go off back to Germany.
Yes. And then it's a matter of the negotiations, how you're going to tax it, whether they'll reinvest here. So it's, but in terms of this debt accumulation and external financial dependence, what we see is that, of course, it's enormous value being produced there, but it's all siphoned off. It's more or less like becoming uncontrolled by the state. And this respect, this nationalistic or government, they. I use this word like it's very neoliberal. So they are in the competition for that international capital. So that's basically the production. So it's I would say the car industry is the most dominant.
Can I just add to that in terms of agrarian production, both the gross amount of product has decreased quite a bit since late socialism, but its value in the national product is also, the national economy has also gone down crazy.
The agriculture? Yeah, but the agriculture is a very interesting thing because, again, that's something locally embedded. So it's not like even like international capital comes and takes it over. Of course, you can't take it out from the country. So the state has a capacity to regulate it. And in fact, it's very important because EU subsidies are going into the agriculture. So a large proportion of the subsidies are actually agricultural subsidies. So what happens here is that the state has a capacity to regulate access to land, which is important for where to again, allocate and channel these subsidies. And we see that it's absolutely, I would call that's an agricultural oligarchy, like the local large capitalist allies of the state who's concentrating land. And this is the most sensitive part of the political project because, bless you, because what has been promised, or this kind of a developmentalist illusion in the rural context was narrated around what they called like the family farmers. So there's a long tradition in Hungary of, the tension between small-scale farming and large estates, like plantation-like estates. It's like a century-old history of social struggle and the ideologies around it. And it's interesting that this regime, I would really say, explicitly lied when they presented themselves as a farmers' party and providing like small scale farming. Okay, they narrated it along family, so like this kind of a language of reproduction, and was very much there. But what happened when they came into power, it was absolutely the opposite. So they realized that, again, almost like a historical legacy, if you want to control local rural population, one way to do it is to have an allied, large property agricultural oligarchic class. And the way you can do it today is whom you give the EU subsidies.
Which also has to do with land concentration.
It's producing such a land concentration that, again, it's interesting to compare it with interwar period. People claim, it's more like Hungary had one of the most concentrated like land ownership in the interwar period or before, and what we know now, it's probably even more concentrated. So it's a very extreme thing, and you see a bit of a kind of a resistance to this. So a bit of a form of opposition to this regime in a rural context is because of this that it was so an explicit betrayal. But unfortunately, it was far right movements where it's again a bit of the historical legacy, unfortunately. But it was the kind of a very extreme nationalistic ideology that was like mobilizing these farmers against this. And that's where really like a political competition appeared in this system in the recent elections. It was very much around this question.
It looks like we should finish up. We're a little past 8:30 anyway. Thank you, folks, for coming.
Thank you so much.
Nice group of people.
It's depressing.